My name is Precious Vines Harris, and I am the Single Maven. The Single Maven is a brand devoted to helping single Christian women find empowerment in their singleness. I encourage you to subscribe to my channel, like this post, and share with a friend. I'm also excited to announce the release of my second book, The Warrior Within, Facing Your Frustrations When You Feel Stuck, which will be released February 2025. I'm starting a new series reviewing the Later Days series on Netflix. Now, this is a documentary that was executive produced by former First Lady Michelle Obama, and it premiered on November 29th, 2024. So this series follows 6 singles in their 50s and 60s as they try another chance at love. Now, each date follows with the dating coach advice given from dating coach Logan Ury. Now, I'm interested in reviewing this series as I think that it will provide great insight into the world of dating and how older, mature adults are navigating the dating scene. So I have about 5 pages of notes for this particular episode. I just recorded part 1 of episode 1, which is entitled Here's to Love, and this is part 2 of episode 1 entitled Here's to Love. So in this review, I will give you my feedback regarding the 3 individuals that we were introduced to in the first part of episode 1. So there are 6 daters. We talked about those before. And in the first part of the documentary, they're talking about Anise, Suzanne, and Nate. So in this part 2 of the review of episode 1, I'm going to actually talk about the first dates for each one of those individuals. I'm going to provide some thoughts on how I think the first dates went and also some feedback about the post-date process. Each one of them actually gives a post-date feedback of the date and how they thought it went. So the first individual that we see that goes out on the first date is Suzanne, right? So Suzanne actually has Allison, her daughter, giving her advice in regards to how to conduct herself, things to talk about, things of that nature. If you haven't watched my review of part 1, watch part 1 because I actually give an introduction of all of the daters, their background, information, and an overview. So I think that that will help you have a better understanding of these daters as I talk about them. So Suzanne is going out on her first date. She's matched with the individual named Frank, okay? Now, Frank is 63. He is 8 years single. He has 2 kids, is an attorney, and is divorced, okay? So my initial thoughts on both of them, I think that Suzanne and Frank are both accomplished. They both have strong personalities. Remember, Suzanne is an optometrist. She actually graduated when she was 28 years old. So she's been in her field for a while, as has Frank, right? So my thoughts on Frank. When I initially saw him, I thought he looked younger than his age. I think Suzanne does as well. So I think that's both bonuses for them. I think that she does say that Frank is too short. She would have to take off her heels. She didn't mention that in her non-negotiable list, but I think as we kind of move forward in the first date process, you'll see some of those additional things that she didn't mention before come out. So I think height is definitely one of her non-negotiables as well. And you remember I mentioned in part 1 of my review, some of her other non-negotiables were kind of on the physical side. She was talking about she didn't want to date someone that had a pot belly, someone that had big lips. So I think a lot of her characteristics she's looking for that she's telling us, not saying she doesn't have any of those other characteristics as far as non-negotiables that are not physical, but what we've heard so far from Suzanne deals with the physical characteristics, right? Frank gives her roses. So if my memory is serving me correctly, I believe they were red or pink, if I'm not mistaken, because I had a note in my notes here that I thought that it was interesting that he gave her that color of roses. I will have to go back and verify that, but he does get points for bringing flowers. And she kind of starts off the conversation with him in regards to a podcast that she's listening to. So if you remember from the first introduction video, I talked about how Logan gave her the advice to be well-rounded, bring up things that are interesting, things you're listening to, things you're reading, so you have different points to relate to someone in a conversation. So she takes Logan's advice, and that's what she does. I thought the conversation was a bit awkward in some points, but I think, of course, with first dates, they're all kind of awkward because you're getting to know someone. So I definitely get why Suzanne shared about her podcast. And also, I think that one interesting thing too is that Frank mentions that he loves to golf. So you'll see throughout the series, especially on episode 2 and on episode 1, she does mention it, that she likes football. So I think this is one of the things that was kind of like on her list, even though she didn't really state it up front. But like I said, we kind of see that we're finding more things that she's adamant about as far as looking at for in someone that she's looking for with a partner. She likes someone that plays football or is interested in watching football, I should say. Now, Frank loves golf, so that's, I think, maybe a point of contention for her later on. In my initial assessment and looking at this, I found that Suzanne seemed to be maybe more of an extrovert and Frank was more of an introvert, which is not a bad thing, right? I think it potentially could work in some aspects because there's an opposing side to the personality that kind of balances out the other person. But I think one thing that she stated was a red flag with her as we move forward, we found out that Frank has younger children. I don't necessarily consider them young. She finds out that he has a 19-year-old son, which is college age, and a 16-year-old son who is a junior in high school. So Suzanne's concern is that he has younger children to raise. She's not necessarily interested in that. So I do find that probably is one of the things that if you are dating a later dater or more mature dater, even if you're younger, I think it's something to think about because as you're dating, you will definitely find people that have children. And I think you should look at that from the aspect of what is your non-negotiables, what ages, what type situations do you find is something more of a like red flag, no versus yes. With her, I don't necessarily think it's that big of a deal because he's 16, so he only has 2 years until college, but she says it's a non-negotiable for her. So I think she's more transparent in that aspect. And I mean, I say kudos to her because she knows what she wants, right? During the day, Frank does lean in to give her a kiss and ask for a number. I thought that was kind of forward, all right? I do want you to put in the comments what you think about that. I think that it is more forward to kiss someone on the first date if you're just getting to know them. This is the first time you met that person. I wouldn't necessarily advise doing that. I would not do it. But she does kiss him on the lips, so I assume she doesn't find it as being anything too forward. But I feel like in my assessment of Suzanne as we move forward, we see that she kind of contradicts herself somewhat in regards to how she thinks that being forward in regards to giving her number, especially when she goes on a second date. We'll see that in episode 2 when I talk about that a little bit more. But with the first date, I feel like maybe she's just testing the water, so she doesn't necessarily go by all of the rules that she kind of gives us in the second date that she has with the other gentleman. But she doesn't have a problem with it, so they move forward with that. And then the post-date analysis. So Frank says that Suzanne is hot, that's his words, and he would date her again and wants her number. Now, Suzanne's assessment, she stated that she uses Logan's advice when she was talking about being interested on a date. We talked about being well-rounded. But one of the areas that she saw as a con was him being too short and having younger kids. So I think a question I would have to pose to you, and you can definitely share in the comments, is do you see height as being a non-negotiable, number one? And number two, younger kids, like what do you see as being too young as far as a non-negotiable? I think that these potentially are things that Suzanne could work around because she mentions if she didn't wear heels or maybe wear heels of a certain height, she could work through that. And considering that his son is a junior in college, it's not like it's a 5-year-old. So I feel like that's not necessarily something that's a non-negotiable. But I think from her standpoint, she does mention this later. I'll talk about this in my review of episode 2, is the fact that he probably married someone that's younger because he has younger kids. So maybe she's thinking about the aspect of being involved with the parenting, co-parenting with someone else and the dating process. So I could definitely understand that as well. So I do think that those are things to consider when you're talking about being a more mature dater, is how you look at dating someone with children or someone with children a certain age. How do you look at that if there is a potential co-parenting aspect? Suzanne's kids are older and adults, so she doesn't necessarily have those concerns. So I can understand where she's coming from in that regard. Let's see, what else do I have here? I talked about that. Now, we do find out later on that Frank sends Susanna an email to follow up after the date. And she says she doesn't know about, I guess, moving forward with him because of the golfing. She loves football. She wants to find someone that loves the Georgia Bulldogs. That does come up more than one time. So I feel like that's one of her non-negotiables. I don't know how I feel about that. I find that Suzanne is very adamant regarding what she likes. And I don't think it's a problem with that. I think anytime you're dating someone, you should be adamant about what you like and you should know specifically what you're looking for. But I think my question with her is her passion for finding a partner that is interested in football due to her past history with her husband and her family, like them having family outings, going to football games together. Is this her actual quest to find someone that is interested in being a Georgia Bulldog fan, or not really interested, but is a Georgia Bulldog fan? Is that something that's holding her back or will hold her back? Because that will come up in episode 2. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. How important is that to her? I think that is an important question to ask because you very well could find someone that is passionate for a particular sport or team, but is that going to be a deal breaker for you? I think that's the deal breaker for her, but I feel like she's kind of cutting herself off from some opportunity to meet people that may be interesting and have a lot of the check marks that she has on her non-negotiable list, but they're just not a Georgia Bulldog fan, right? So let me know what you think about that. I found it quite interesting because it comes up a lot. And it will definitely come up in that second date. So we'll talk about that in my review of episode 2. All right, so let's go to Nate. I don't think I mentioned this in part 1 of my review in regards to Nate's history with his former fiance. So in my first assessment of Nate, I gave a review of him, his ex-girlfriend Jackie, the fact that they had a child together when they were in college. But it was something interesting. And when I went back and looked at my notes, I found that I hadn't talked about this because in the documentary, the way they view documentaries, they kind of jump around at different individuals. So they give you a part of this, a part of that for that person, then come back to that person. So my notes were kind of like in sections for different people, and they have different scenes for each person. So I didn't have all of Nate's notes all in one section. So I want to actually jump into something I didn't get to before, but I think it's important to note. Because Nate tells us he had a former fiance that got pregnant by another guy when he was engaged. And I find that interesting because you remember in the last part 1 I was talking about that there was a question of how his ex-girlfriend Jackie got pregnant when they were in college, right? The question of whether she was on birth control or not. And the fact that she actually wasn't. And we see that Jackie is with them throughout this whole process of dating again. So I feel like that maybe he has resolved maybe those issues or feelings because technically at this point the child is 18. So it's kind of where, they probably worked through those issues years later. But he tells this story of the fact that his former fiance got pregnant by another guy when they were engaged. And then he actually tells us that he's dated women. He says of his dating history that the women that he's dated have not actually told him the full truth. And that leads him to cause him to have trust issues. And I think that part of his history will make it hard for him to be vulnerable in a relationship because the 2 stories that he told were of him having issues or concerns with trust issues in someone that he was dating. Either they didn't give him the whole truth about being on birth control and got pregnant, or the fact that they were actually with someone else and got pregnant, right? Nate tells us that the only woman he's completely trusted in his life was his grandmother. I find it interesting because I think that with Nate, that's going to come up again and again in regards to how he looks at the dating process. He states that trust is earned. I don't necessarily disagree with that in that aspect. I think that, especially when you're first meeting people, you have to earn trust. And I think that goes by looking at people's actions versus what they tell you. Someone can say that, oh, I'm a trustworthy individual. I never lie. But who knows, right? I think that you have to get to know people to earn a level of trust for you to reveal yourself to that person, right? I think that in this aspect and how he's presenting himself in this documentary, he has not fully resolved those issues. I think that he's self-aware. And remember when I was mentioning in the first review how I think it was a niece was self-aware of her own shortcomings as it relates to getting past like the third date, and also some of the issues she was having in regards to revealing things about herself, like her education and things that she's accomplished. Um, with him, I think that's going to be a part of the problem that may hinder him from moving forward in some areas because he has trust issues, right? So we see Nate go out on his first date. His first date is this woman named Latricia. I think it's how you pronounce her name, Latricia. She's 56, never married, no kids, an IT professional, right? So we see that Nate gets ready for his date. He said he's only been on one blind date in his entire life. I found that very interesting. Um, but he talks about wanting to have control of how people perceive him and wanting people to have a positive experience with the visual of how he's dressed, his appearance. I've never heard anyone say that before, but I think that's interesting because in relation to how he wants other people to view him, his level of control in this whole process is how he presents himself. And I don't think it's anything wrong with it. I do think that you should look at a level of keeping up your appearance in general, but especially when dating, putting your best foot forward. But I think also, um, if you look at that as kind of somewhat a barrier for you being able to be accepted by someone you may be dating, right? Meaning you're trying to gain approval by how you dress, how you are perceived. And if that person does not perceive you in the same manner, there's a barrier in how you move forward. That may be a red flag, right? Because I've never heard anyone say that they want people to have a positive experience with the visual of how they're dressed. I mean, I found that interesting. That may be something that people have said before. I just have never encountered anyone saying that. And I found it interesting because I think that that is his level of having some control in the dating process. And I don't think it's anything wrong with it, but as it relates to your perception of how people perceive you and being accepted, I think that probably would be potentially a yellow flag moving forward if it's something that hinders you in that regard. So there are a few areas in a date with Latricia that I want to bring up. I think that these are things that come up, I think, as it relates to Christian dating or dating in general. The first thing that happens is Nate asks if he can pray. Like they're at the dinner table and he asks if he can pray. Latricia starts to check off invisible boxes, right? And I find it very interesting because they're at the table. She was like, oh, check, he prays. And I'm thinking it's interesting because I'm thinking, okay, number one, as they're going through the date, she continues to check off these things on her invisible checklist, right? Nate tells her he doesn't drink or smoke. She starts checking off the invisible check marks on the invisible boxes, right? And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I see where she's going with this thing, right? She wants a Christian man that does not smoke, drink, prays, religious, goes to church, yada, yada, yada. And she's thinking that Nate is meeting these criteria as she's checking off these boxes, right? So this is where I have to pause because I think that there's nothing wrong with having a checklist, right? I think we should all have non-negotiables as it relates to dating. That's anything in life, right? There are things you would definitely say, yes, this is a go for me. This is a no for me, right? I don't think anybody should reveal that on the first date. I don't think that you should reveal your hand on the first date because number one, you're just getting to know that person, right? I don't think that you as a woman should do that because I think it puts you in a vulnerable position because you've given that person a view of your hand before you even start to play the game, right? And I'm not saying just because you may check off a box or let someone know, oh yeah, I am looking for somebody that fits blah, 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 that, you know, you're totally giving over all of your cards. But what I will say is this is a first date. This is a getting to know you moment. This is an information gathering moment. And you don't want to come off as too pushy or too desperate. Yes, you may be looking for a Christian man. Yes, you may be looking for a man that goes to church and prays. But guess what? You could very well find that person and he could be horrible in his personality. And I will tell you a story about that as we move forward. But what I will say is make mental notes in your head. Don't reveal your hand. Okay. Make mental notes in your head and don't reveal your hand. I think, as a woman, if you are dating and you're more mature, you have more things to lose as it relates to moving forward in the dating process. So you want to be careful. I think you want to be prudent, and I think you want to be smart. And just be observant. It's not saying that you're not checking these boxes off, but do you want to do it in public at the dinner table in front of this person, like you're grading a paper? No, you don't want to do that, right? So don't reveal your hand. Later on, we will find out that was one thing that Nate saw potentially as a red flag, because we do find out that Nate is a Christian, right? He's not that much of a churchgoer that Latricia thinks he is. And I find that interesting, because I do agree with her that it gives her hope. That's one thing that she says, is it gives her hope as it relates to finding someone on her same religious path. There's nothing wrong with that. There are many women I know that actually are Christians that are looking for someone that's Christian to date and to eventually marry. But as we move forward, Nate reveals to us that he's more spiritual, quote unquote, than religious, right? So where does that put Latricia in this whole dating process when she's checking off these invisible boxes? Because the man prays over the food. I would hope he would pray over the food somewhat. I'm just saying. Because I think this Netflix series is filmed in Georgia, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if all of them are in Georgia, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, most of them are. So, you're in the South. This is the Bible Belt. So people most of the time probably pray over their food, right? That doesn't mean that he's, Mr. Churchgoer, because he knows how to say grace. Just do a little bit more investigation and observation. My suggestion would be to ask more questions, right? Get to know the person. Because in my experience, like I said, I've definitely dated people that said they were religious and Christian and hold positions in the church and had horrible personalities. That's a whole separate vlog for a separate day. Horrible. Horrible. So don't get too hung up on the fact that you're looking for someone that's a Christian that actually is a churchgoer, praying, etc., etc. I think you should look for those qualities as you move forward in the latter part of the dating process. Date number 1, find out the person's last name, okay? Find out where they work. What are some of their hobbies or interests? Have general conversation. Don't make it too heavy where you're looking to check off all of your boxes because you're trying to walk down the aisle in the next 5 seconds, because it's not realistic. It's not prudent. It's not smart. And I think that it puts you to a disadvantage when you're dating, when you reveal your hand in the beginning. All right. So I would say ask more questions, get to know the person. Finally, we see Anise on her first date. Now, this is interesting because Anise had a very interesting first date, you guys. And I think that this one is comical. All right, so let's talk about her first date with George. George is a 60-year-old man, right? So George tells us that he wants to fall crazy in love again with someone who feels that same way about him. George is divorced, 7 years single, 1 child, retired, nuclear security professional. I don't really know what he does in the nuclear security, but at any rate, somewhere in that field, whatever, he's retired. So, I do find it interesting that George says he wants to find someone to fall crazy in love with, because how he comes across in that first date is totally different from what he said. George has many red flags. We're going to talk about them. I want you to tell me what you think about it. The first thing that George says is he tells Anise that he likes a woman that's a little ghetto. I thought to myself, wow, red flag number 1, right? So you can kind of tell from Anise's reaction that she's just very taken aback, I will say. Now, he does bring her flowers, which is a great gesture. I think that when we see Anise entering the room, now remember I told you in the part 1 of my review of episode 1, I thought that Anise, even though she's older, she dresses younger. And I've told you I thought that her dress was a little bit more sexualized than I think she should come off, but who am I, right? We see that her skirt is a bit short and tight. Now, you can tell by George looking at her, he notices how she's dressed. And he finds it appealing because he lets her know that during the date, right? Remember when I told you in part 1 of my review how this will come back and this may not necessarily be a great thing for Anise to continue to do. Because during the date, he makes interesting comments. He says he likes women who wears blonde wigs because he thinks they're a little ghetto and that's what he likes. He asked her if all her children are from the same man. Now, that's very interesting because you remember from part one, we found out Anise has been married 3 times and all of her children are adult. Now, I thought this was a big no-no because number one, who asked somebody if all of your kids by the same person? She's 62. All of her kids are adults. At this point, what does it really matter, right? This is the first date and you're trying to get to know someone, but why do you need all of that type of information in order to have a first date, right? So my thinking is, okay, even if her kids are by different men, if she's been married 3 times, that's very logical. That could be the truth, right? It doesn't mean that she is someone that's maybe more loose in her approach as far as her relationships and how she actually encounters them and having children. But Anise is 62 years old. So my question would be, as a mature older dater, what questions are more appropriate, right? What bearing do they have on how you move forward with that person, right? But even if you're thinking it goes to a question of her character, would you ask it on the first date? I found that very interesting. So I don't think it's a significant factor, but George asked that question. She looked at him like he had 2 heads. And then at that point, she excuses herself to go to the restroom, right? So I think this is kind of where in my notes I have to make sure that you ask appropriate questions that are not too intrusive. I think that in the dating process, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What may work for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person. But anytime you get to know someone in dating or just in general, you never ask super intrusive questions when you first meet them because they don't know you. Like we talked about, a level of trust is earned. I'm not going to necessarily reveal all of my cards, all of my hand, everything that happened in my past, my backstory, and all of my baggage in the first date. It's not appropriate and it's not warranted. I think as you get to know someone, you will naturally find out more about that person, right? But asking questions that have no bearing on the initial dating process, to me, in my opinion, is a no-no. So my advice would be, be cautious of how you look at that. And if someone were to ask you a question that is super intrusive, how are you going to respond, right? That's something you do have to think about, right? He goes on to say a lot of other little things that I think are inappropriate. And I remember writing in my notes, Anise, run, girl, run, get away fast. Because I'm thinking in my mind, this person has no filter. So this is definitely not the person you probably should be matched with, right? He does reveal to her that he dates around. He says that he has different women in his bed. And I'm thinking, wow, you are really, 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 really forward in how you are approaching this whole dating thing, right? But after Anise excuses herself to go to the restroom, she comes back and lets them know that she has to leave. It's been nice, but she has to actually leave at this point. And then we find out in the post-date analysis that she pretty much was not really feeling what he was saying. He was too intrusive, and I can't necessarily blame her, right? So I do ask you, if you were in Anise's shoes and this was your first date with someone, what would you do? What would be your advice? And I think that anytime that you're in a situation, whether it's dating or otherwise, and you find yourself in a situation where someone is making you feel uncomfortable and they're too intrusive in what they're saying or how they are approaching you, I think it's definitely okay to excuse yourself and just, exit from the date. You can let them know you have other plans or, it has been nice to get to know you, but, I do have another appointment to go to or something of that nature, because I think that if you see that he's not necessarily being disrespectful to the degree that, he's personally disrespecting her, but I think some of the things that he's saying is a bit off cuff. So I don't necessarily think it would be wise for her to continue on the date with this person. So there you have it. This is my synopsis of the first full episode of Later Daters, Here's to Love. We did a quick summary of the first 3 daters, Anise, Suzanne, and Nate, right? We've all looked at their introductions. We've all looked at their first dates. And I think overall, we can summarize this with saying they all have had unique experiences in their first dates. I don't think either one of them has found love at this point, but needless to say, they actually have put themselves out there and they've taken the initiative to get uncomfortable and start the dating process. So I think that's really the biggest takeaway I can say from episode 1. I encourage you to leave your comments. Let me know what you think about it. And my advice to you as a final synopsis is never be afraid to put yourself out there and meet new people, right? With that being said, thank you for joining me in my analysis of part 2 of episode 1, Here's to Love. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. And until next time.